Today I wanted to talk about Eddie Murphy's HBO special that was called Delirious. There was also an audio version released that was called Eddie Murphy Comedian. That won the Grammy for Best Comedy Album in 1984. Remember that fact as we talk about the album. And that's the version that I'm probably the most familiar with as 14 and 15-year-olds. We listened to that on cassette a lot. Before I start today, a couple things. One, I come in peace. I don't come to offend anyone. With that in mind, a lot of the Eddie Murphy material specific to this period used a word that has quite fallen out of fashion for good reason. It rhymes with maggot and it starts with an F. It is a slur. I'm not going to use it. And I will just say F word as I tell the stories here. It'll make the reading a little bit awkward, but again, I come in peace. In the second half, I'm going to go track by track and think back to how we used to experience that album as kids, again, 14, 15 years old. But as you can hear in my voice, and if you're familiar with this material, it has become quite problematic over the years as time marches forward and we all become more educated and hopefully become better people. From Decider, Eddie Murphy had just turned 22 when he recorded his first HBO comedy special, Delirious. The audio version, Eddie Murphy Comedian, won the Grammy for Best Comedy Album in 1984. But all these years later, Eddie Murphy's opening routines don't receive quite the same admiration from the home viewing audience on Netflix. Wikipedia counted 230 F words and 171 S words in Delirious. That was the record. He'd also go on to set the F-bomb record in Raw, only to see Goodfellas break that. Think about that, 230 times. Wow. Decider writes, from the opening montages, you're in for something special. We see scenes between tour stops. Eddie Murphy jokes about overdosing on heroin before acknowledging to the camera, no, not me, and then jokes about dying in a plane crash. If he really wished to be but a shooting star, he never truly let us in on that or followed through. His career would only continue to climb for the decade to come. Decider writes, if you skip past those first 15 or so minutes, and we're going to talk about those, past Murphy's downright falsehoods about AIDS and even how he's in his sexual prime, you'll get to his finely tuned impersonation of musical giants Michael Jackson, Elvis, James Brown, and Stevie Wonder. So let me jump in there, because 14-year-old me is connecting with 50-something-year-old me. That Elvis impression, if you mention lemonade to this day, I'll go, lemonade, that cool, refreshing drink. Just like Eddie does it in the special. Well, not, you just heard me do it. Not at all like Eddie Murphy does in the special, but you get the idea there. The Stevie Wonder, I picture in my mind Eddie Murphy going, shut the F up, Stevie. The Michael Jackson with doing the high-pitched voice going, is it all right if I come down there and sing to you? We all remember that. Decider continues, some other bits offer comedy Easter eggs in retrospect. You'll now know that it was the late Charlie Murphy playing the fart game with young Eddie in the bathtub. While Eddie's bit about white guys casting presidential ballots for Jesse Jackson as a joke sounds quite accurate of a description of some Trump voters 32 years later. And in one very outdated moment, Eddie Murphy asks if anyone brought a camera to the theater. He takes a picture of his groin and says, let's see you explain that one to the guys at Photomat. Boy, that's all dated. For everything else, as many jokes stand the test of time, as do those who fail it. In 2012, The Guardian wrote, Comedy Gold, Eddie Murphy's Delirious/Comedian. The setup. Eddie Murphy was stand-up comedy's first true megastar, fearless, good-looking, a gifted mimic, leather-clad, and towering self-confident, propelled by TV success on SNL to Hollywood success in 48 hours. He made this concert film in 1983, just after his hero, Richard Pryor, had proved that this was something comedians could do now. It remains arguably the most famous stand-up comedy performance of all time. I agree with that. In a recurring theme, The Guardian writes, you do have to make a few decisions about watching Murphy's stand-up now, though. There's homophobic material in here, which he's since apologized about. There's also a fairly old-fashioned attitude to women and a delight in himself that maybe under the circumstances is easier to indulge. Murphy says, I F with everybody. I don't give an F. I don't mean anything by it. The Guardian says, for what it's worth, I believe him. Unlike Pryor, Murphy was never much of a social commentator. What he is above all, and has always been, is a virtuoso of the voice. At best, the words are half the point. He does impressions, and what's special, apart from his electric attitude, is just how very, very good they are. Funny how? Ask Mr. T to record the lines that Murphy delivers in his voice, play each version after the other, and I bet you can't choose the real one consistently. But The Guardian adds, it's a bet I feel safe in making, because I don't think Mr. T is likely to cooperate by reciting Murphy's gay fantasy about him. Murphy was a more versatile and successful actor than Pryor, but I think he was a worse comedian. The emphasis on setting himself up for the next impression means the show is actually quite light on jokes, and some of his observations, children's fear of kissing ugly relatives, for instance, or of dropping ice cream, have since become gag standards if they weren't then. By sheer force of popularity, however, this show changed comedy, And Eddie Murphy has a talent you could watch for days. From his predecessors, he took inspiration. To his successors, he passed on power. Vulture took on the album in 2011 and said, "The bad first, because it's impossible to avoid. The first joke that 22-year-old Eddie Murphy tells when he gets on stage is, 'I got rules. F-words aren't allowed to look at my butt while I'm on stage.'" He then launches into a 15-minute bit of grotesque, aggressive homophobia that includes jokes like, "I'm afraid of gay people. I have a nightmare and I go out to Hollywood and find out Mr. T is an F-word," and he ends with a riff about how he doesn't really like women hanging out with homosexuals because what if they go home to their man with AIDS on their lips? Time out. So this is when I am glad I did the preamble at the beginning that, I come in peace. And at one point we were 14-year-old kids. Specific to that joke, I remember the punchline because it got repeated in the schoolyards, which was, "Sure, you're not a homosexual." Vulture writes, admittedly, 1983 was a different moment in the AIDS crisis when transmission was still mysterious, but this is still unremittingly horrible stuff. Making it more off-putting, this isn't one joke stuffed 2/3 of the way into the routine, it's the opening crowd-killing bit. Vulture continues, the homophobia is not all that aged poorly. Embedded in the opening riff is a long digression imagining that Ed Norton and Ralph Kramden of The Honeymooners were lovers complete with impersonations. Time out. Again, the 14-year-olds in the schoolyard, we would go, "Hey Norton." And we wouldn't do the rest of the joke. It was just the "Hey Norton" part. I don't think I ever pondered the entirety of the bit. It was just the "Hey Norton." Vulture throws in here someone wanting to do a read on Murphy's early work with the persistent rumors about his sexual orientation in mind might point out where Murphy's imagination keeps taking him. Surely a 1983 audience was familiar with these two characters. ... Any piece of entertainment that makes constant pop culture references runs the risk of seeming out of date, and Murphy's work is no exception. Murphy is a wonderful impersonator, but his impersonations have aged better when they're about more anonymous and thus more timeless characters like a stepfather or an Italian guy all hepped up on Rocky when they're of Stevie Wonder or Michael Jackson, who feel like even easier targets now than they did in the 80s. Vulture writes, in the course of doing this as fact check, a number of men told me when they were younger, in their early teens, they used to put on Eddie Murphy records or watch his performances and cackle. You can include me in that. Certainly a lot of his material was over their head, which was part of the appeal, but much of it aimed squarely at them. His riff about the ice cream man coming was something they could relate to. It's sealed with a hilarious, painful kicker about the cruelty and honesty of children who breathlessly and hilariously taunt each other, you didn't get none because you're on the welfare, you can't afford it. In Delirious, Murphy is wholly magnetic. He seems like he's having the best time and is so in control of everything that's happening on stage. It's all effortless. In another New York piece from 1982, Dick Ebersol, who was overseeing SNL at the time, says about Eddie, he never loses the charm in his eyes. His eyes tell the audience he's laughing. All right, I'm doing this from memory. I haven't listened to the entire album in some time as I've programmed the comedy channels at SiriusXM and now on Live One. I've heard the individual bits, but I have not listened to this as a piece in a while. Here's a track listing from the audio version, Eddie Murphy Comedian. Again, the album received 1 Grammy, Best Comedy Album at the 1984 Grammy Awards. The opening track is called F-Words Revisited / Sexual Prime. This is the aforementioned bit where you're not allowed to look at Eddie's butt. That's why I keep moving. You don't know where the F-word section is, so you keep moving. That's also the section with the Mr. T material and the Honeymooners material and the AIDS material. So in there, again, as 14-year-olds, we would have quoted the "Hey Norton," the "Sure you're not a homosexual," and the Mr. T line, "You look mighty cute in them jeans." The next bit has aged better, I think, from memory. Singers, 10 minutes and 4 seconds. That's the part where he does the Michael Jackson impression and he does the Elvis impression. As I mentioned earlier, the Lemonade line, the "Can I come down there and sing to you?" That is a strong segment. Then we go into the Ice Cream Man bit / shoe throwing mothers. That's 5:52. Again, as kids, you would be like, "Ice Cream Man, Ice Cream Man." Really, this album was ingrained in our brains. Modern Women at 2:16. I don't remember doing that in the schoolyard. The next track, The Barbecue, is 12 minutes, 44 seconds. I know at one point at Sirius, we did some sort of pick the best bit of all time contest, something. The Barbecue won that. It's personally not a favorite of mine. I find it a little long, and the Aunt Bunny with the mustache, Goonie Goo-hoo, I just feel like it's too long and I kind of want it over. Track 6 is The Fart Game, not my kind of thing. Track 7, Politics / Racism, I don't really remember. Track 8 is Languages. I think he makes fun of a stereotypical Chinese impression in there. And then track 9 is TV. I think that has the bit about Haunted Houses and Gets Out, which I remember that being pretty good. So as I look back here, 40 years later, seems like the first part of that album is what really stuck in our brains. And I'm being fair here and I'm being honest here. A lot of the offensive stuff is what stuck in the brains of the 14-year-olds. But I don't think we did it with malice. I think we just quoted individual lines as knucklehead kids do. And in the course of putting this together, I was looking for vintage Eddie Murphy interviews. Didn't find too many, except this one from 1987 from Interview Magazine is fantastic. Eddie is asked, what works better for you? Do you think of yourself more as a comic actor or a comedian? Eddie, I'm a comedian who got into movies, so I don't really think of myself as an actor. I started out as a stand-up comedian, and that's what I'm most comfortable doing. Making movies is time-consuming and it's boring. You spend most of your time waiting between takes. But I like doing stand-up more when I was not so well known before my material was looked at as what Eddie Murphy said. When I wasn't so well known and I did my act, I just got laughs and wasn't put in the spotlight. It wasn't like every time I said something about somebody, it turned up in the paper next day. There's Eddie Murphy being controversial again. My people say, hey, you got to watch out because of who you are. But as far as I'm concerned, I've always been Eddie Murphy. When I was in high school, I used to wear a suit, a shirt, and a tie with a collar pin, carry a briefcase, and have my cashmere coat slung over my shoulder, and everybody would say, there goes Eddie Murphy. Interview said, I heard that you showed up at the comic strip one night after having been recommended by a friend and said, when do I start? Eddie said, it didn't happen like that at all. A friend of mine told me I should start trying to work out at the comic strip. I went over and introduced myself, and I got at the bottom of the rotation, worked my way up, and I went on from there to do SNL. All right, Eddie, what are your feelings about SNL now in 1987? Would you ever go back and host? As we know from the future, he eventually did. In 1987, the answer was no. As far as I'm concerned, the show is finished. It doesn't mean anything to me. I don't watch it anymore, and I have no interest in going back at all. Danny Aykroyd hasn't set foot in Studio 8H since he left, and that's probably the way I'll be. I was there once since I first left, and that's it. I'd rather do movies. More people see movies anyway. I mean, people in Japan don't see SNL, but Trading Places was a big hit there. I don't care about doing TV anymore, not as a performer anyway. On SNL, we probably had more freedom to do and say what we wanted than any other show, and there were still a lot of things we couldn't do or say. You just get tired of running up against that, and the censor's telling you can't say that, or we'll let you do this if you take that out. It's not like anybody was trying to say F on the air or something. Speaking of networks, did you know that Bill Cosby once called me up and told me he didn't like my act? That's very funny from the future. Cosby said if I wanted to see how it should be done, I should come down to Lake Tahoe. I have a lot of respect for Cosby, especially as an actor. They asked him about starting on SNL with producer Gina Dumanian. That was the failed season at one of the worst times in the show's history. Could you tell you were taking part in an unmitigated disaster? Eddie said, nope, not at all. I was only 19 when I started on the show, and if it didn't work out, so what? My life wasn't going to come to an end. I auditioned for SNL, made the cast, but I was only a featured player when I started the show. I was having fun being on television. I was in community college for a while, but I knew I was wasting time there. The worst tragedy ever to happen to me was when I lost my father. It was effed up, man. I was 8, but I've had a good life. That's why all these comparisons to Richard Pryor tick me off. He's had a tough life. He's been through a lot of crap I've never had to face, and I'm here because of him. This is really interesting, him talking about Pryor, right? Pryor paved the way for me. I grew up listening to all those albums. I heard them so much I could recite them backwards and forwards. I would sit in the basement for hours and listen to That Ends Crazy and Bicentennial N-Word and go out and do stuff from those records for my friends. People call me a genius, but he's the real genius. It was great listening to all that stuff because it was like I knew I was doing something I shouldn't be doing, but it was brilliant comedy. First time I saw Pryor was right after the fire. It was the only time I'd ever done something like a critic would. I sat up there with my notebooks and I was ready to take notes because at that time I was doing my stand-up act and I was curious to see how his act compared to mine, and I could see what he was doing, how he was moving the audience around by working his feelings out in front of them. Nobody does anything like that. But it was like whatever he said, the audience just loved him. I've seen the reverse happen with him too. I've seen him go out and try some new material at the clubs when the crowd is ready for Richard Pryor and his material is new and different and raw and the audience sits there like, that ain't funny. Eddie, would you like to work with Richard Pryor? Yeah. But I know that when we get together to do something, it'll have to be so funny it kills. We'll have to be ruthless. People will be expecting so much from us. We'll have to go in and do it hard. What about comedy albums, Eddie? You haven't released one in a while. Still true. Listen to this answer. Eddie, you know why I haven't done any more comedy albums? Because I made a bad deal. I made a 5-record deal, and I don't see the kind of money off them that I should, so I don't do them anymore. Wow. Fascinating. All right, now put a bow on this. I think this ties up where we started. Interview Magazine asked, Eddie, do you ever reflect on the circles you travel in and just trip out over it? Eddie says, I don't, because I'm just a man. I think people are reacting to something else when they see me. They're not reacting to me. They don't even know me. Since I started doing movies, I noticed that people react differently to me. When I was on SNL, people would walk up to me and try to talk to me like they were old friends of mine. Now that I'm just doing movies, they act nervous, like they don't know what to do around me because they can't get to me in the same way. All these rumors get started, like that I'm gay. Interview Magazine said, "You've said some pretty controversial things about gays." Eddie said, "I don't have anything against F word. Oops," parentheses laughs. "I know gays and I've made some jokes, but I wasn't trying to be vicious or mean. That's why I don't want to be out in the spotlight all the time. I want to move on to other things. I want to keep concentrating on my music. I know it's not always going to be important for me to be in front of the world. That's why I always keep my boys around. They keep me real." That's your comedy news for today. Follow the show for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. See you tomorrow.